So, welcome to this podcast, this episode of the podcast, which is all about today part of the Resilience Collective, which is a series of resources that we've been producing around specific aspects of mental health. And so far, we've covered stress, depression, anxiety, and addiction. And today, discussing self-harm disorders and phobias, with a specific focus on self-harm, because I am really delighted to be sitting here with Yaj Buljeean, who is a trainer and clinician at Harmless. So thank you for coming, Yaj.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited about this because we touched base briefly at the start of the week, and we had to stop ourselves launching into depth in the conversation because there was just so much to say. And I love your approach to talking about what can feel like quite a tricky subject because you are so grounded. You've got a wicked sense of humor. You're very easy to listen to. So in terms of this conversation today, I'm really excited about people being able to listen and go, actually, that's not such a scary topic after all.
Oh, that's really lovely. No, I really appreciate you saying that, and it's really easy to speak to you as well. I've been really looking forward to talking about this topic. In my social life, I talk about it quite often, and that's because I never want anyone to feel afraid of speaking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so a little bit about me.
Yeah. Do tell us a
Um,
little bit about you and a little bit about Harmless.
Yeah, so as Lisa said, my name is Yaj, and I've been working for an organization called Harmless for about 2.5 years now, which is really exciting. I've been working mostly as a trainer for the last 2.5 years, but as of 3 months ago, I've also started work on their clinical pathway for self-harm, which I'm really excited about. It's something I've been wanting to do for a really long time, and I've finally got the opportunity to do it. I'm really passionate about helping people. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to be a trainer because I want to help support people who might be supporting others through distress. But what I noticed is that with training, I don't have that other viewpoint. And so, as part of being a clinician, I wanted to get the view of frontline workers, teachers, anyone who works in business, or anyone in like a front facing position, anyone who's working with people, really. I wanted to get that view to know what it was like because each individual conversation that you have is going to be different, it's going to be personalized. And it's one of the things that I love about our organization. So, Harmless is a user led self harm prevention service. We're actually a national leader in our field. And as part of that, we also look a lot at suicide prevention and suicide bereavement too. Now, as part of this work, we don't just want to look at someone and think, okay, we've got a blanket solution that's going to fit everyone. We take a very individual approach. And I think that's really important to discuss because often, especially in a business place, we often use very blanket solutions for everything, but there's never a one size fits all. And particularly with something as sensitive and emotive as self-harm, because it's often derived from things like trauma.
Mm,
Not always, but
mm.
often.
I really like that approach. And I think, I mean, that's anyone who knows me will know that I'm always banging on about you can't have blanket approaches to anything. Um, and, you take the term depression, what depression actually looks like or means and how that's experienced for anyone who's experiencing depression will be unique for each individual. And so it's very easy to make assumptions. And that's what we're going to sort of unpick a little bit today. And actually, the resource that accompanies this episode, which is around self-harm disorders and phobias,
Mm.
is very much geared to an individual approach. It's about not having to have all the answers and be an expert and know how to cure something. It's about actually using the expertise that the individual experiencing a particular need has, that they are the expert in themselves and they know what helps and what doesn't help. And so it's really
Yeah,
good to hear you say that.
absolutely. And it's interesting. So I'm all about language. Language is really powerful. And especially when we think about what's the cure? But that means we're treating it like, if we're thinking that there's a cure for something, it means that we think of it as a disease
Mm,
or a virus. And self-harm, it's not a disease, it's not a
mm,
virus, it's not something that you can catch,
mm,
you know. And so it's remembering that it's something, it's a behavior that's rooted in distress.
mm,
Okay. And so we want to think about the term recovery. It's possible to recover
mm,
from self-harm. And again, it's individualizing the approach. It is possible to recover, but what that recovery might mean for someone can be very different. And what I failed to mention in my introduction as well about myself is that, as well as my professional experience within this area, is I also have a lot of my own lived experience as well. And recovery has been something that's been really important throughout that journey.
mm,
Remembering that it doesn't always just mean stopping self-harm. Sometimes it simply means a reduction in self-harm, or maybe not thinking about it quite as much as you might have before. And
mm,
that's okay.
mm. I think what would be really helpful is
Hmm.
to actually explore what we mean by self-harm, because I know when I speak to people and use that term, they often associate that just with someone who's, for example, cutting themselves, and they
Mhm.
don't realize the breadth that that term covers. Can you tell us a
Mhm.
little bit more about how you understand, what you understand self-harm to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So self-harm, according to the NICE guidelines, so the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, it is the intentional injury, irrespective of the apparent purpose of the act. Okay. So it's an injury that we self-inflict. Now, that doesn't mean just cutting.
Mm,
Okay. There are many different methods of self-harm that people can use. And um, the problem is, if we only ever think that self-harm is just cutting, it means we're ignoring all of the other signs of someone's distress. And I think we touched on this on Monday when we had our chat, because
mm,
we also want to consider methods such as self-hitting or hitting something hard. We want to think about things like scratching, burning, you know, and even down to things like, it's a bit more of a gray area, but we all harm ourselves in many different ways, whether it's through self-talk and the way we talk to ourselves. We might really put ourselves down, like, oh, I've done this really stupid thing. I must be stupid. I must be crazy. That's harmful. Okay. But we only ever look at the very physical side. And I think that's part of the problem when we think about self-harm. We only ever pay attention to the physical injury, when in reality, that injury, the harm that we see, that's just the symptom. That's the symptom of self-harm. What we're missing is everything underneath the surface, which is the underlying distress. It's the reason, it's the function why someone has to self-harm in the first place.
yeah, I think it's so good to hear you explain it like that, and that's a really clear um, kind of guide in terms of how we need to open our mind to what we think of in terms of self-harming behavior. It's always that interesting sort of in terms of use of language when you said about the grey area and you talk about negative self-talk, which I think is a really good point to highlight, because so many people do that on a regular basis and they don't think about that as being damaging to themselves. But also things like exercise. I know people who exercise excessively, but it's almost seen as that's a positive behavior. That's really healthy. But actually, at what point does that tip over the edge into being something that's more harmful? Drinking, eating. There are so many things that we can engage with that are healthy to a point, but then the balance tips and it becomes more harmful. And so I don't know if that's something you help people try to unpick and actually make sense of themselves, but when they perhaps are veering towards engaging with the behavior as a way of coping, that is now starting to become harmful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really important. Um, I think it's really insightful as well. I love that you said that, because a few years ago, well, when I was about 28 years old, I remember I was going through a really stressful period in my life. And I've never been particularly big, but I was healthy. And then when I hit this really stressful point, I ended up losing loads of weight.
Mm.
Um, and it was just down to stress. I wasn't eating, I wasn't sleeping very well. But the amount of comments that I got from people saying, "Oh, you look really good."
Mm.
And I thought to myself, I'm actually really not very well. I'm really not very well.
Yeah.
And it felt like if I said that out loud, then I'd be met with, "Oh, well, you should feel good that it was
Mm.
almost like, well, at least you losing weight is the silver lining."
Mm.
And it
Yeah.
was really damaging. It made me not want to speak to people because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's almost comes onto that language bit, doesn't it? What you were saying then just reminds me of, I mean, it's not self-harm, but I remember when my son was struggling to get sleep at night, night after night, he'd be struggling to sleep and he just wanted to be read books all the time. And everyone would say, well, that's fine. He's reading books. Like, what's the concern? I was like, well, he's not getting the sleep he needs. But people will often look at, well, it's a healthy behavior. And actually they're not looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
But the
I,
language, tell me a little bit more about the importance of language around self-harm, because I think again, there's a fear factor around,
yeah.
what if I ask someone the question? It's a little bit like suicide. What if I ask someone if they have had suicidal thoughts? Well, am I planting the seed in their head? What if I ask about self-harm? Is it okay or not okay? Or what if someone mentions self-harm to me? What should I say? There's that whole language
Yeah.
bit, isn't there?
Yeah. And because of that language, there's so much pressure. It adds so much pressure.
Mm,
And so, first of all, I want to tackle the suicide question because I think that's the biggest one that people are afraid of. And again, I think it's really important to normalize the word suicide. It's okay to say the word suicide.
mm,
The reality is that most people think if I ask this question, I'm going to give someone the idea to do it, or I'm going to plant the seed in their head. Okay. That's all about us. That's not about the person in front of us. So at that point, we're more worried about what we're saying and the effect it will have than the person in front of us and what they actually might need or want. Now, there's actually no evidence to say that by talking about suicide that you're going to give someone the idea to do it. If someone is already exhibiting signs of distress, like self-harm, for example, the reality is that they're already thinking about suicide.
mm,
I mean, according to NHS data, at least 1 in 5 people in the UK are having thoughts of suicide at any given time. And I know that sounds like a really scary statistic, but actually, I want to look at it in a positive light. It actually shows how normal it is. So, why are we afraid of having this conversation? And the reality, again, is that 1 in 5 is likely to be an underrepresentation. The likelihood is that stat is actually much, much higher. And so it means that we should be talking about it more. We always have these questions in our head of, what if I say the wrong thing? But let me ask you, what if you say the right thing? Okay. Isn't it worth that chance? And we want to ask about suicide because what will happen if we don't ask that question and we suspect someone is that that person's not safe.
mm.
We're making an assumption that that person is safe. Now, asking about suicide, asking about self-harm, it doesn't have to be a scary question, but actually, it's a really caring question to ask.
Mm.
It's a very compassionate question because you actually care about whether that person lives or dies or not, and that's important. And we want to create that safe space without judgment, without the stigma attached to it. Because when we do that, we can break down barriers to people being able to seek help, whether they're self-harming or whether they're feeling suicidal. Because isn't that the point? We want to keep people safe.
Yeah, I think the intention to do the right thing is so important. So even if we um, don't feel we've got the language quite right, and some people get tied up in knots about we shouldn't say commit suicide, and then someone says it, and then it's like, oh my gosh, I said that, that's terrible. It's like, if we're having the conversation, the intention is to help someone, that's the important thing. And I'll often, one day a week, I wear a psychotherapy hat, and often in those conversations I'll just ask, have you had any thoughts of hurting yourself over the last week? And then people, depending on what they say, that conversation can go in a number of different directions. But actually, the sense of relief when people say, when they have this space, that someone's asked me that question, it's like, actually, I've thought about this, but I know I'm not going to do it. Or I've
Yeah.
thought about this, and this is my way of coping, which again gives us insight that they need a different way of coping, a different coping strategy. But having just that space to be able to be honest and open, and unless we put that invitation out there, people often will not just volunteer that information because they won't know how it's going to land.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely 100%. I really resonate with that because I found myself in that position so many times throughout my life,
Mm,
you know. Um, Even having opened up about it myself to a number of different friends, they never knew how to respond.
mm,
And because of that fear, it stopped them from wanting to interact with me. And that's what hurt more. I would have rather that they fumbled through the words and checked in to show the care
mm,
than to ignore it
mm.
because it only amplified the loneliness.
I think that's such a good point. I've actually this morning messaged someone I know who's going through a bit of a hard time at the moment and said, "Good luck today. Hope you're okay. Let me know how you get on." And then ended that message. And then straight away thought, oh, actually, she might not want to let me know how she got on. So I messaged her back saying, if you don't want to speak to me, that's absolutely fine as well. So you've got to do what's right for you. But it's very easy
Yeah,
for us to think we impose our expectations on what we're expecting. And actually, if we can give someone space just to speak up when they want to speak up, or actually just not say anything because I'm not in the mood for saying anything right now. But
yeah,
it's being very aware of the permission that we're giving other people.
yeah. And I think it's also remembering that not everyone will have the words to express how they're feeling. And sometimes, let's say you have someone who said to you, I'm self-harming, I'm really struggling. Best policy is honesty.
Mm,
You might hear that, and you know what? There is nothing wrong with saying to that person, I don't even know what to say right now, but I'm just so glad you told me. Do you want to talk about it a bit more? Do you want to sit down? Do you want to have a cuddle? You know, it doesn't have to be scary. We make it scary for ourselves.
mm.
Naturally so, because we live in this culture, particularly in the UK, we have this culture of being really polite. And it's not polite to be invasive. But again, asking how someone is and being honest with them when you don't have the words or
Mm.
when you don't know what to do, express that because otherwise you just end up in your head.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, just asking the question, if someone says something to me, and I'm just thinking, a lot of managers know that they're in a position where they are supposed to be having very good quality conversations with people, but the fear of what might come up will often stop them. And actually, if someone says, I'm struggling, then to ask that question, well, how's that showing up for you? Or because it's again, is it that I'm just locking myself away? Am I harming? Am I throwing myself into work to distract myself from something else? Like, what is it that's happening? But I think if we can kind of create uh, the space and the permission to say what is happening for me right now, and for managers to know that it's okay to say, ask the question, how can I help?
Yeah,
And not to have to feel that they've got the answers to go in and respond in a way that's going to add lots of wisdom or is going to help move this person forward and help trying to solve their problems. It's actually just saying, as you said, I'm really glad you told me. How can I help? What can I do? And often again, the person might just say, I just want to tell you, I don't need you to do anything. Or actually, I could benefit from X, Y, or Z. The person listening hasn't got to solve the
yeah,
the challenges coming up.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's kind of the difference between sympathy and empathy when we're supporting someone. Sympathy is that ability to say, I'm sorry that's happened to you. but look on the bright side. But empathy is recognizing, it's recognizing the feeling. It's recognizing that everyone goes through distress. I can see you're in distress.
Mm.
I'm going to get in that well with you. I'm not going to stand at the top and shout down. I'm going to get in there with you. And even if we just sit, that's fine. Maybe
Yeah.
you just want some company.
So what about in terms of some people, quite a lot of people will not open up. They will not share the fact that they're self-harming. And we know that actually a lot of that's about the sense of stigma, shame, feeling embarrassed, and so on.
Mhm.
What should we be thinking about in terms of helping
Yeah.
organizations tackle that so that is no longer a barrier?
So again, I want to think about language. Okay. Language and the language that we use in an environment, in our work environment, is really important. Depending on the kind of role that you're working in, if you're using words like, oh, this is crazy, this is oh, that's mental, if you're speaking about things openly, but in a negative light, then we're only perpetuating the stigma.
Mm,
Okay. Um, I've previously worked in an office. So prior to working in this area, I used to work in customer service and recruitment. And I loved my roles, but I had to leave because I hated the attitudes and the behaviors in those workspaces. Because unfortunately, I come from a childhood of trauma. And working with people who don't recognize that or just haven't been through any kind of experience like that, they're not always very sensitive to those who have.
mm,
And I remember I really struggled with self-harm during those years. And I dreaded going into the office because it felt almost like there was a bit of bullying. I was quiet, I was shy, I was often called really weird, you know. There's almost these little microaggressions that can happen. But one thing in particular that really upset me and just sort of it didn't make me leave, but it really made me want to get out of the environment was quite a few years ago, there was a death by suicide that occurred in Nottingham, and it was on the radio. It was very public, and I remember my colleague saying straight away, "What a selfish thing to do. I hope that person died painfully." And I could have, I could have cried. I could have cried because all I could think about was the person who died and
mm,
how lonely, distressed they must have been in to be
mm,
in that place. And then to have someone on the outside who didn't know them or anything like that was really hurtful.
mm,
And I experienced my first suicide at the age of about 12 years old. Yeah. At
mm,
12 years old, that's when I knew someone who died by suicide. And it was in a public way.
mm,
And it was extremely distressing. It was awful.
mm.
I understand attitudes towards self-harm and suicide. I do, because I have seen both sides of it. But ultimately, again, if you work in that office, then moving forward, if I was ever in crisis or if I was really struggling, I knew that wasn't a safe place for me. So I think building up this culture of, again, being mindful of what you're saying in your environment is really important.
I think it's a really interesting point actually about because we know that employees are walking if they don't feel so they experience a kind of workplace culture where it meets their needs, and we talk a lot about sort of well-being and flexible working and those sorts of things. But actually, if you're not feeling safe in terms of
Mhm.
the use of language and behaviours, attitudes around mental health and certain whether it's certain things like suicide or it's just general what they call banter around the
Yeah,
language that's being thrown around. I'm so OCD and all those kind of comments. If people don't feel safe, then they will walk as well. And I don't think we probably think about that category of people who aren't feeling safe in that environment.
yeah.
Do you have statistics around actually the how many people are likely to be self-harming? I'm just thinking about in terms of in terms of making this feel relevant
Yeah.
for workplaces, which obviously you and I know, but there'll be some people thinking that self-harm stuff's for other people. It's not for my
Mm,
workforce. Do you have any
mhm.
stats that can help us paint that picture?
Now, the reality is, in terms of statistics, we actually don't have that many. And
Mm,
that's because self-harm hasn't been as extensively researched as suicide.
mm,
That is an ongoing thing. But what we do know is that according to the World Health Organization in 2014, there were at least 16 million cases of people self-harming worldwide. 16 million. Now, again, the reality is that was an underestimate at the time, and it's likely to be even higher now in 2024 when we consider what's happened. Even in the UK alone, we've got the cost of living crisis. People are worried about their finances. People are having to use food banks when they've never had to before. People not being able to keep their gas and electricity on and not knowing how to cope with that.
mm,
And again, that's the biggest thing when we're talking about self-harm. Ultimately, one of the reasons that people self-harm, whether knowingly or unknowingly, is that they're trying to cope with the underlying distress in the absence of knowing of another way of coping. If you think about when we were at school, we were never taught how to cope with things, how to cope with big stressful events. We were taught math, English, crafts. But what about this vital life skill? How do you cope in the face of adversity?
mm. So what are there general risk factors then do you think that would be worth highlighting? Because I mean, what you've just said is a kind of societal risk factor, the cost of living crisis means that people are more vulnerable. So as a manager, as someone in a workplace, not even a manager, just an employee looking out for other people, what would be if someone doesn't come up to you themselves and um, reveal that they are struggling and that they might be self-harming, what signs should I be looking for in
Yeah.
others?
So I'd be looking for things like changes in behavior.
Mm,
Um, Often we think of those as really negative, but I think it's also important to highlight the opposite
mm.
as well.
A bit
So
like the
are there any?
example you said about losing weight and everyone saying that's
Yeah,
amazing. It's like actually there's a change. You've lost weight. What's
yeah,
going on? Yeah.
yeah, exactly like that.
Mm,
You know, it's things like even work performance. If you've had someone who's been doing quite, let's say, not poorly, but they've been doing average, and
mm,
then suddenly it goes up. Okay, I want to monitor that. Why? Why has it suddenly gone up? What's happened?
mm,
Because I would be pleased about it, but also I want to know, has something changed? Okay, because again, there's signs of distress in there. Are they trying to reach that point of perfectionism? Is there a control element?
And
Is there
that's really
some?
important then for people to, again, look at their employees
Mm,
or their colleagues as people, because I think if a lot of people potentially could look at a spike in performance going brilliant and gloss over everything else, it's like we are hitting our targets. This person's, excelling in their performance is like really, really happy with that and not stop to ask a question about why that might be.
yeah. And it's also important because often when we think about suicide and self-harm, we often think about the people who aren't doing very well in that work environment.
Mm,
But again, self-harm affects people from different backgrounds of all ages, of all ethnicities, everything,
mm,
And I know a lot of people who actually do really well in workplaces are some of the people who self-harm.
mm,
Yeah. So it's trying to look out for, again, it's not, I don't want it to sound like pressure, but it's trying to look out for, again, each individual. Like, do you recognize your staff? Do you recognize their stress signatures? Do you recognize your own stress signature?
mm,
Because we know, well, we know when we are at that point of stress, but we know are we recognizing the early warning signs before that stress starts to really hit? For me, one of my stress signatures is I'm normally quite tidy. My stress signature is that when I start leaving empty cups or half empty cups of tea everywhere. Yeah,
which is what we were talking about before we hit
yeah,
record.
yeah. So when I start leaving half empty cups of tea everywhere, or when I keep sighing, that's when I know, right, I'm reaching my my point. I need to start putting some stuff in for myself. Can we recognize that in our employees? So if you've got an employee who's normally really on time or gets here a little bit earlier, and now they're starting to creep in a little bit later, or they're a bit more tired than usual, there might be small signs, but they might also be quite impactful signs as well.
Mm,
Even just reminding someone that you care about them in that environment, just saying, oh, I noticed
mm,
you're a little bit late today. It's nothing to worry about, but just want to make sure you're okay.
mm.
Simple things like
Yeah.
that. It's human connection.
Yes, and I guess the thing that struck me then, or came to mind then, was a conversation I had with a company last week who were talking about the fact that they are shifting their practice from billable hours to utilizations, I think the term they use. In other words, how many hours are they using to do the paid work? And let's look at that. And then it creates space because it's acknowledged that some hours are not going to be used for that can be billed in the same way because those hours are having the conversations that need to happen between people. And if we don't consciously create that space to check in, to notice, like actually just even noticing, like before you even have the conversation with someone, that
Yeah,
something's not quite right, it's not their normal.
yeah,
We've got to have the space to notice that in the first place. And that's not going to happen if we are being driven by performance sort of targets and
yeah,
expectations around how much we're billing and everything else. So
yeah,
it's so to consciously take that step and say we are prioritizing people, and as colleagues or managers or whoever, we are giving you the space and the permission to do that
yeah,
by and then being very clear about what the process is that supports that to happen. I think that's a
yeah.
big step forward.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important, again, not just for the employees, but for the managers too,
Mm.
because, one thing that I notice in my current workplace as well is our managers do so much. And I'm just like, there's always parts of me that are like, are you okay?
Yeah.
And I don't feel like it's my place, but I'm still like, are you okay?
Yeah.
You know, I want to speak to you. It's okay.
Yeah.
You know,
I think it's
people get,
everyone's place. I think
yeah,
and it is again it's getting over that those kind of traditional beliefs around it's the higher up people who look after
yeah,
us kind of on the ground level. It's like actually everyone has a duty of care to look
yeah,
after everyone else. So
yeah,
I think that's quite an important
yeah,
shift. Um,
absolutely. It reminds me of what we spoke about on Monday actually, which was when we think about children,
mm,
there's that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Why does that then go away when we're adults? you
yes.
know, it's still, we are, as human beings, we're really social creatures. We thrive on having these relationships around us, these nurturing relationships around us. Again, how can we incorporate that into our working lives?
Mm,
We spend so much time in work. Why would we want to miss out on that? Why
mm.
should we miss out on that? You know,
So what can organizations do in terms of practical things
yeah.
for people who are self-harming or they might suspect they might be worried about their self-harming or perhaps someone's disclosed that. What should organizations do or not do?
So I would say in terms of some things to do, um, it's about creating that safe space to have that conversation. So thinking, right, are we in a private space? Does would that like what would work for that employee? If someone's disclosed someone to you, ask them what environment they'd feel comfortable talking about this in. Because some people feel great talking in a room opposite each other, but some people might want to go like change the environment. So go for a walk
Mm,
maybe. Okay, so first create the space. Okay, and create the time. Okay, this isn't something that you want to say, I've got no time for this right now. So we'll talk about it on Friday.
mm,
Okay, no, like if someone said that to you, that means they've trusted you enough to be able to open up. And we want to acknowledge that. So if someone disclosed to me, I'd say thank you for telling me because that can't have been very easy. Okay. Can you tell me a bit more about what's been going on for you? Okay. And we want to start listening to the reasons that's driven this person to this place. Now, again, it's not about the injury, okay? It's about the underlying distress that is driving this behavior. Okay, so we want to try and find time to explore that. And again, you're not here as an employer to fix that, but knowing where to signpost someone to can be hugely beneficial. I'm not saying that we have to sit down and go through everything and have, have your own sessions every week. I mean, it might help to have check-ins regularly, but knowing where to signpost someone, you know, and if it's happening regularly, maybe consider training within your organization for your managers. Okay. Because the last thing that we want to do, we don't want to risk losing people. And while self-harm and suicide are not the same thing, there is a relationship between the two. And self-harm can be a risk factor for subsequent suicide. That does not mean that everyone who self-harms will be suicidal, and not everyone who is suicidal will self-harm. Okay. But it does mean that if we know someone is self-harming, we can be proactive about their care and not wait until they get to a point of crisis where we risk losing them.
Mm,
So
yeah.
as an organization, it's thinking about, what do we have in place? What are your policies? Do you have a specific person within your organization, HR, for example, who's able to have these conversations and provide that one-to-one support?
Mm,
Okay. I want to remind you that self-harm and suicide, they are not mental illnesses, they are behaviors. And that's important for someone's sense of recovery, because it's possible to change a behavior.
mm,
Okay. It's not just about signposting someone to your local GP or, a mental health service. But have a think, is there any, like, Google it in your own local area. Are there any specialist self-harm services in the area? Okay. Or is it something else? Are they struggling with financial crises in their life? Can we get them some help and support for that?
mm.
And this is where third sector organizations come in, and it's where sort of Harmless sits best. So, yeah.
I think I mean it's a really good point to make that um about the self-harm is not a mental health disorder.
Mhm.
Um it is the behavior. And I think if people can keep that in mind, it helps them perhaps think about what's going on underneath and focus on the what's going on underneath and what can I do to help you influence that, because we know if we actually deal with some of the what's going on underneath in terms of the stresses, then actually it's going to change the behavior that's resulting as a consequence. So yeah, I like that emphasis on actually talking about what I can influence. I can't tell you, and I'm not going to tell you to stop self-harming, because that's not my job to do that. Actually, I might, if I know, for example, you're cutting. One of the things I do a lot when in my role is if someone tells me that they're cutting or they're scratching, we talk about how are you safe doing that? Are you using
Yeah.
clean blades? Are you cleaning up afterwards? Are you making sure that you're safe? And we have a very open conversation about that. And it's like, yes, I am. Well, that's good. So now we're just going to park that now because I know you're safe on that level. Now let's look at what we can do to try and help you feeling the need to do that. And
Yeah.
that's the space that people in a workplace can influence. Because if there's something that's causing them to feel overwhelmed, to feel stressed, that's building up to that point of harming, then maybe as an employer or as a colleague, we can help you address some of that. Or if it's nothing to do with the workplace, then certainly someone outside the organisation, a professional should be able to help.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love that as well. It's such a nice way of supporting someone who's self-harming.
Mm,
Um, I mean, if it's okay, I'd like to share a little bit. I know we've not got loads and loads of time, but I would
mm,
like to share some of my own experience with that, particularly in regards to someone asking you to stop.
mm,
So for those listening, just a emotional safety reminder, because I do want to be open, but talk about it in a safe way. But my experience with self-harm, it did start from a really young age. So I was 8 years old the first time that I self-harmed. And I remember it was something that was incredibly private. It was something that I didn't want to share with anybody because I knew in my bones that it was something that I didn't want anybody to know about.
Mm.
And this would have been back in the late 90s as well. There was no Facebook, there was no social media. None of my friends were doing it that I knew of, so there was no copying anyone. It happened in a moment. And it happened because I couldn't calm down. I couldn't get relief. I remember on this day in particular, I was crying and crying, and I just couldn't overcome all of the stresses from that day. And I lived in a domestic abusive household, and I really, really struggled. I didn't really have anyone I could speak to. I felt lonely. That self-harm, it happened instinctively.
Mm.
And I felt better. Once I'd done it, I felt better. But shortly after, I realized what I'd done, that I'd done it in a really obvious place. And I knew that I had to cover it up. I I didn't want to face the judgment from adults because I also didn't have the words to explain. I didn't know why I'd done it. I had no insight into that experience. It's only through many years of therapy that I understand this now. And then I kept it secret for a really long time. And it wasn't until I was 12 years old that I got found out. And the person who found out was one of my parents. And when they found out, they called me lots of names. They reacted in fear, which came out as anger. They
Mm.
said that I was crazy. They said that I was stupid. And they said that I belonged in a nut house. And then after they said all that, they said, you have to stop. And it felt like more of a threat than a request.
Mm.
But I loved my parents and I wanted their approval. I wanted to show them that I could I could do good. And so I tried really hard to stop. But without another coping strategy in place that worked for me,
Mm.
I felt lost. I felt really trapped. And that's when those thoughts of being able to manage through my self-harm transitioned into feeling like I had no other options left. And it led me into my first suicidal crisis at the age of 13 years old.
Mm.
And at 13, I'd made my first plan to end my life. I'm still here now, thankfully. But it wasn't until I was about, well, I went through two more suicidal crises in that time. And it wasn't until I was about 22, 23 that I finally sought a therapist.
Mm.
And I tried speaking to doctors and nurses, I tried speaking to mental health professionals. And because I'd gotten so good at masking and pretending like I was okay, to them, my self-harm wasn't severe enough or frequent enough to warrant extra support. I'd gained so much mistrust, I didn't want to speak to anybody. And then I finally sought support. And then I managed to stop self-harming for a good few years. But at 28 years old, I went back to it and I was really upset with myself. I thought I'd thrown away all that progress. I was so ashamed I didn't even talk to my therapist about it.
Mm.
But after I opened up to her about it, she said the nicest thing to me, which was that the journey of recovery, sometimes it's going to involve a few steps forwards and a few steps backwards. And she told me that just because you self-harmed for the first time in a long time, it doesn't mean that you haven't recovered. It means that you're going through some really big challenges right now,
Mm.
and we need to bolster up your support.
Mm.
And it made me realize that, again, that journey of recovery, it is certainly a journey. It's not a destination. And it's definitely not linear. And I needed to hear that. I needed to hear that it was okay. And
Mm.
in reality, my version of recovery now, as an adult, that happened when I was 28. I'm 33 now. And now I'm in this position where I haven't self-harmed since. And I haven't acted on any thoughts of suicide. It doesn't mean that I don't have urges,
Mm.
but the difference now is that I know how to recognize my early signs, and I have trusted people, very specific people in my life that I can talk to, But honestly, if someone asked me that question, if they said, "Are you self-harming or have you had a history of self-harm?" I'd be like, "Yeah,
Mm.
and thank you for asking. If it's out of support, thanks for asking, because that's really brave too."
But I think it really highlights, doesn't it, that your experience, a couple of things, the kind of the masking bits, and it's
Mm.
we have to be very mindful of people appear okay. You have no idea what's going on beneath the surface, and I think we can get lulled into just focus on the people who really obviously are not okay in that moment and kind of gloss over the others. And it's
Yeah,
about making sure that we don't just take face value,
yeah,
take people at face value, because often there's so much more going on. But also about your point about, you now know what your stresses are, who the people are to go and reach out to. If you're feeling that kind of emotional arousal begin to creep up, you can recognize, but you know what to do about it. And wouldn't it be amazing, actually, if everyone, it goes back to what you said earlier about not getting taught it in schools, wouldn't it be amazing if everyone was given that's kind of just basic life skills, life knowledge that we should all have,
yeah,
as much as knowing how to read and write. It's that sense of self-awareness that would look after ourselves and each other so much more and reduce so many of the problems and destigmatize. When you said about having a break and then going back to some self-harming behavior, actually, again, that's really, really common. It's,
yeah,
whatever that is, it might be addictions or it might be any,
yeah,
all life is a journey. And it's about being
yeah.
able to normalize and say, oh, this is where I'm at right now, and not feel that sense of shame around it.
Absolutely, because no one's perfect, and
No,
no one's asking you to be perfect.
no,
I promise you, no one's asking you to be perfect.
no.
No one expects that of us, but it's just about trying the best you can. It's about doing the best you can with what you've got. And
Mm,
especially within a workplace as well, that's all you can do sometimes.
mm.
If it comes from that good place, then try. The least we can do is try.
So, are there any other sort of particular piece of advice or particular
Mm.
messages that you think it'd be useful, as in your from your position as an expert in this
Mm.
area and working with Harmless, that'd be useful for people in organizations and companies to think about regarding this topic?
So I'm sure I've mentioned language so many times, but it really does make a difference. So being mindful of the language that we're using, you know, being mindful about, ourselves. Like, are we approachable as a person, as an organization? Are we actually approachable? You know, because if we're not, then we're not fulfilling what we need to fulfill. Okay. If your employees aren't able to come to you, how can we build up trust with our customer base or our clients?
Mm.
Okay.
But I think that also comes back, doesn't it, to some people just tick the box and say, yeah,
Yeah.
we've got a mental health first aider, or our managers, you can talk to any of our managers, but actually they haven't got the relationship bit right, which is
Yeah.
based on trust, based on psychological safety, that ability to be authentic and to know I'll be heard and respected. And,
Yeah.
that's the kind of the basics. That's for me is the fundamentals of good mental health and well-being. It's about the
Yeah.
workplace culture and what
Yeah.
we experience day to day, not the
Yeah.
who's going to zoom in and rescue us if we're having a bad
Yeah.
day.
It can't just be tokenism.
Mm,
It's not just doing it for doing sake. Like, you actually have to care about people,
mm,
and care about what's happening to your employees. And again, that will probably get you a lot of results too.
mm.
I've seen it. Again, like I normally job hop. This is the first organization that I've been in where I want to stay literally forever. I love this place because of that culture.
Mm.
I feel supported, not just by my management, but by my colleagues as well. They're not afraid to check in on me, and I'm not afraid to check in on them. And that's lovely,
But it's
you know.
genuine care, isn't it? And I think that's something
Yeah,
can't you can't fake.
yeah,
People can see right through it.
yeah,
Which again goes back to something I talk quite a lot about, are the right people in the right roles. So if you've got
yeah,
people in roles that are about looking after other people and they don't really genuinely care enough about it,
yeah,
it's not there's no shame attached with that. There's no, it's just, that's not their interest or their skill set. So,
Yeah. And
um,
that's okay.
yeah, exactly.
That's okay.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Um, and again, what I would also say is that there's also a lot of self-stigma. There's lots of expectations that we might have on ourselves too. So again, particularly, we know that males are particularly affected by self-harm, and they're likely the ones who are going to mask it the most. Recognizing those behaviors. I know plenty of people who, until I've started speaking about different methods of self-harm, for example, hitting and
Mm,
self-hitting and hitting other things,
mm,
I've had people who've said to me, I didn't realize that actually what I was doing was a form of self-harm,
mm,
and that's massive.
mm,
And to not ignore it,
mm,
hold space for yourself, make sure that you are getting that support for you as well, because you deserve it, whether you're an employee or in a manager role, or the CEO of a company, take the time to look after yourselves, to look after others, because if you're not, well, what's the point? I want you to think about that oxygen mask analogy. When you're on a plane and that oxygen mask comes down, whose mask do you put on first?
mm,
It's got to be yours so you can help other people.
mm. Good, wise words, Yaj.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I'm really pleased. I'm very very appreciative of your contribution as well to the resource that's going to accompany this conversation, because I think this conversation, hopefully for people, normalize talking about self-harm and suicide, take the fear out of it. And
Yeah.
you've given some lovely examples of language that people can use
Yeah.
just to start the conversation or encourage the conversation to continue without having to take on an expert role or try to solve anything, but it's just about creating that space. So um, that's lovely. And I think the resource that goes with it will be uh, very practical in terms of these are things to think about at an organizational level. If you're thinking about what to do to prevent um, mental health declining or behaviors associated with people having sort of emotional mental challenges, from sort of showing up, what can we be doing? But also if you're having one-to-one conversations or one-to-one support, what should that look like? So lots of sort of quite small, quite achievable examples in the resource, for people just to prompt the conversation. And again, it shouldn't be landing on one person's desk saying, right, sort this out for your organization. It's got
Yeah.
to be a conversation that there are a number of people coming together and saying, right, how do we think about this? And if you've
Yeah.
got people, imagine saying to your organization, actually, we're going to have a focus on self-harm to make sure we're looking after people well. If you've got an interest in this, or if you've got lived experience, or if you've got just something
Yeah.
you want to say, then you want to be part of our working group to make sure we're getting the policy wording right, or to make sure the provision is right, or whatever. It's about sharing that responsibility.
Yeah.
I think that makes such a difference to the poor soul who otherwise gets it on, that responsibility sits on their shoulders, and it's like it's a really hard gig.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of, it is Self-Harm Awareness Day on the 1st of March. Yeah. And
Yes.
so I again, not in terms of tokenism. It's not that we should only be doing things on days of significance, but maybe that's a good time to start a conversation in your organization. Again, just like you've said, Lisa, can we incorporate people who've got lived experience? Can we, again, not forcing anyone, but providing an opportunity if anyone wants to talk about it?
Mm,
Can we have those safe conversations? Can we create that safe space? Um, and as part of something that we're doing at Harmless is we run a national conference every year on Self-Harm Awareness Day. If anyone is interested, Lisa, I'll send you some more information on that as well.
yes, do. We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that'd be really
brilliant.
great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yaj. So people can look in the show notes for the links to the resource. It's called Self-Harm Disorders and Phobias. It's the suffering we don't see, dispelling the myths and shaping helpful solutions. And hopefully from the conversation we've had today, people will realize that those helpful solutions really come down to the essence of just being a really good human being, which is about relationships and showing we care and not having all the answers, which I think just takes a huge pressure off us to have to become an expert in all these different areas of people's behavior. It's like, actually, no, just go down. It's the same behaviors in all pretty much all the resources that are part of the Resilience Collective. There are some, there are core things. If you get those right, it doesn't matter what someone's experiencing, you'll be doing the right thing by them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. I love that so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yaj. That's been brilliant.
Thank you, Lisa. It was really great. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for letting me speak on the subject. Don't know if you noticed, I'm really passionate about it.
Just a little bit, a little bit. And can people contact you if they want to know? I mean, certainly we're going to have
Yeah,
Harmless's details in the show notes, and we'll have your details as well. So you're happy for people just to reach out if they want to touch
yeah,
base.
please do. Yeah, absolutely. I'll pop my personal email in there as well. Well, my personal work email
Yeah,
in there as well. So if anyone has any questions, wants to get in touch, please, by all means, please do.
yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.